around.
Yeah, it's a bad plan. Things end poorly. Good morning, everybody. So I tackled this assignment in a particular way, which I'm not sure is the way you were thinking of, Peter, but it's what I did. So here we go. Covering both the draft state energy plan, which comments are due in the late end of September, and NYPA's draft energy plan, which is due a little sooner than that. I did them one at a time. I didn't do a sort of integrated analysis of both side by side. And the way that my team has been looking at the state energy plan is through the lens of the CLCPA, the climate law. And so what I'm going to present here is just a comparison of what is the scoping plan, which came out of the CLCPA. How does the scoping plan from 5 or 6 years ago compare to the draft state energy plan that just came out? Sort of where is their alignment and where are their misses? And then in the second half, I'm going to tackle the NYPA plan, and then a little side by side at the end. But feel free to stop me anytime if there are questions or clarifications you want. I don't have to have this be a monologue at all. So just to set the table, I assume you all know this, but just in case it's not fresh in your mind, the state law, the CLCPA, is mandating 70% renewables on the state grid by 2030 and zero emission electricity by 2040, which has always been assumed to mean including nuclear on top of the renewables. And the scoping plan was a plan that people from across the state, all different kind of stakeholders, hashed out over, I think, like 2 years. Like an enormous amount of brain power was put at this scoping plan to try to make a roadmap, because the law itself wasn't a roadmap. It wasn't an actual plan. It was just a directional thing. And the scoping plan was an attempt to make a roadmap to say, how do we get there? And there was not a draft state energy plan put out 3 years ago or so, because at the time it basically, the assumption by whoever was that, well, the scoping plan is the state energy plan, so let's just go with the scoping plan. And here we are a few years later, and now we have another draft state energy plan, and it definitely diverges from the scoping plan in some key ways. The scoping plan, for a first thing, was definitely targeting actually meeting the goals of the CLCPA law, and said, we're going to get to renewables, 70% renewables by 2030. Like, these are hard and fast things, as if there were penalties involved for missing them. But there weren't actually any penalties built into the law. And other than maybe some state agency staff feeling like they missed the mark, there is no teeth anywhere. And the draft plan explores some delays, which Hochul, the governor, has been talking about for a while anyway. And I think her overall positioning on renewables has been far softer than my organization had hoped for. And I think, although she talks a great game about being a supporter of renewable energy, I haven't seen a lot of it. There are occasional flashes of light where it seems like she gets it, and then mostly she doesn't seem to.
Yeah, and Marguerite, I should say right at this moment that Bob Howarth will be joining us in September to talk about his assessment, I guess is a good neutral word of where we are with the state.
Yeah, Bob would be a better person than I to make those comments. So thanks for that context, Peter. And I think, for things like the gas system, in the scoping plan, it basically attacked the gas system writ large and said, how the heck do we decommission this whole thing and just transition the whole thing over? And the draft plan doesn't really talk about that at all. Like, it sort of pretends like there is no need to transition off gas, and just sort of says, well, someday we'll get there, and doesn't say anything specific about how to get there or, any incremental steps in between. I think this is both a reflection of the reality that there is not enough generation right now in 2025 to start decommissioning people's homes. I mean, there's both the residential gas use for heating, and then there's the energy generation side of the gas system, and neither side of the infrastructure is ready for the gas system to really start taking off aggressively right now. electric transmission and distribution systems to support much wider spread electrification just haven't been built out yet. And the renewables that would be supporting that are also not built out for a wide range of reasons. So I think the draft plan is on the one hand trying to be realistic to where we are, but on the other hand lacks any ambition to get better than where we are. So I think that's the good and the bad of it. On cap and invest, the governor has just kicked the ball down the road repeatedly on this one. And so I think there was widespread hope among CLCPA nerds that out of cap and invest from a pot of money that really cool investments could be made. And the draft plan doesn't say a thing about it. It's like cap and invest doesn't even exist in its worldview. And that's disheartening because it sort of puts the lie to the governor saying, oh, we're just a little slow on cap and invest, but it's still coming. It makes us think that it's not still coming. On energy storage, the scoping plan had a target of 6 gigawatts of storage. Right now, there's a 3 gigawatt actual mandate somewhere in the law. And the draft plan doesn't talk about it and doesn't give any specifics on energy storage. And that, I mean, from an actual grid management perspective, if we're going to have as much renewable energy on the grid as we would like to have, commensurate with decommissioning the thermal resources, and by thermal I mean both nuclear and fossil, we need massive amounts of energy storage. And the technologies are there, both short-term energy storage, in the 4 to 8 hour range, and then the long duration stuff, which there's a wide open playing field of interesting companies doing cool stuff, from storing energy in compressed air to raising and lowering heavy weights to all kinds of stuff. And there's commercial deployments of it elsewhere in the world, but the energy plan treats it as if it doesn't really exist and doesn't need to be accommodated. So that's rather disappointing. Right now, there was not, in the state energy plan, there was nowhere near the discussion as there was in the scoping plan around retiring the peakers in New York City. Right now, the peaker plants in New York City, whether this is said in the newspaper or not, it's the fact of the matter. The peaker plants in New York City are largely running as baseload power right now because energy demand in New York City has gone up already. And there has been almost no new generation coming in other than the one offshore wind project that's online so far. That's South Fork Wind. And there's 2 under construction now that hopefully will come online next year. But other than that, there's no new energy in the city. And as power demand has ramped up, those peaker plants now run all the time in it, which is a particular shame because they're extra dirty. I mean, combined cycle would be cleaner than running the peakers at full bore, but that's what's happening. So that is both waste of money, extra pollution, and particularly bad for disadvantaged communities in the downwind plume of those plants. The scoping plan, took seriously the greenhouse gas limits and thought about it economy-wide and, worked really hard to make the numbers work, if you will. The draft plan doesn't even talk about the numbers and doesn't set interim targets and doesn't put any teeth if you don't make them. It's as if the draft plan treats the CLCPA as a suggestion, not a law. Same thing on fossil fuel equipment in buildings. The scoping plan had specific timelines and laid out a whole bunch of stuff around building decarbonization, and the draft plan is just sort of like, well, we should electrify someday, and that's kind of all it says. On the implementation of the CLCPA, the scoping plan is effectively the implementation plan of it. And so the scoping plan towed the line of the CLCPA in every way because it had to. That was its job. And the draft plan stripped out a bunch of the language around disadvantaged communities and equity and trying to bring fairness to the energy system writ large. It just doesn't. I mean, it's sort of weirdly echoing the federal landscape where all of a sudden DEI is illegal and you get chased out for that. It's as if the draft plan caught the echo of that and reflects that, which is disappointing because, on the one hand, Hochul says that where New York is going to be a bastion against Trump and all of that. But in the draft plan, her staff did not really stand up for that at all. And it could have. Like, you don't have to use the word DEI or any other language like that to actually get that job done. You could hide it if you're needing to hide it for the sake of safety, but it can still be accomplished. But it's clearly just not that important anymore. Same thing with co-pollutant stuff with respect to peaker plants and all that kind of thing. There just aren't metrics, there aren't targets. There's not anything firm that says we have to do this by this date. And unless you have something firm, nobody actually gets anything done. It all just seems very hand wavy. So, as I think, Peter, you were sort of alluding to at the beginning of this, the draft plan is just so much weaker than the scoping plan was, and just throws the CLCPA kind of under the bus is too strong, but it just sort of ignores the fact that the CLCPA is actually a law and can be used and should be used. And so I think the question for you all and for my own organization is, to what degree do we want to lobby for this draft state energy plan to actually go back to the CLCPA and the scoping plan commitments and say, what is achievable? I mean, I agree with the statement that's been made in all kinds of public places that we are not on track to meet CLCPA goals in terms of renewable energy build out. We just aren't. And a lot of that can be laid at the feet of New York State and its agencies and its overregulation of all kinds. If I were queen for a day, could I make things go a lot faster because that was my central goal? Yeah, of course. But that's not where we are politically, both federally and state. The damage is done. 6 years into trying to build renewables from the CLCPA, it's not for want of trying to push projects forward. There have been hundreds and hundreds of renewable projects proposed, and just most of them are not yet under construction, and definitely most of them aren't built yet. And so it's not dishonest to say we're not meeting the CLCPA targets on time. And so, the draft plan acknowledges that, and I think it's a healthy thing to acknowledge, but it doesn't mean that we can't quit, that we have to quit trying. There's still a lot of avenues open that I think the state should be pushing harder for than they are. So I'll pause there for this bit before I jump into the NYPA stuff. Any thoughts or questions on any of this?
I've got everybody on mute, but I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes,
yep,
I do.
Dave's going. Go ahead.
Okay.
So in behavior modification, you've got positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And my question is, what politicians or high-level bureaucrats go to jail when the CPLCA is not met, or else they get the living beans fired or fined out of them, and they lose their jobs and they lose all their privilege and other things? Because right now, it's just a voluntary compliance, and then you don't, if you don't meet your goals, well, you can still enjoy yourselves at the 19th hole on the golf course.
You nailed it on the head, Dave. Nobody going to jail if it ain't met, that's for sure. And so even, I think there are a few state employees, some folks at the agencies that do permit review, and some folks at NYSERDA who genuinely want to accomplish the climate goals and do their jobs every day to try to achieve them. And I think there are a lot of folks just collecting a paycheck and not really actively trying to solve climate change with their day-to-day work. Brian was the next hand I saw.
Yeah.
Sure. So there was tremendous enthusiasm among most of us and the general public about passage of the CLCPA and the development of the scoping plan. The scoping plan had 7 special sector groups. Some of us, not I, but others were on some of those sector groups. There were 35,000 public comments. So there was tremendous support for moving ahead. And the DEC managed to kill that interest by dragging all of the regulation creation out over months and months of stakeholder meetings and partial efforts at what they were going to do. And it, and the state energy plan is the final nail in the coffin. Nobody's going to be excited about this. We're losing the enthusiasm to do, and we have headwinds. We need a lot of public enthusiasm to have a relatively modest forward progress. So I don't know how we move from I think we really need to be going aggressively after this state energy plan because it just doesn't meet the needs.
Irene?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for this. So you ended up with something that I can't resist following up on. If you were queen for a day, what are the things that you would want to see changed in terms of regulation or process? And is it worth trying to put those into the plan? Or if not into the plan, how else do we advance them?
So maybe would be a short answer. I think one of the significant drags that Brian just mentioned is DEC itself. I think it's ironic that part of its mandate is climate change related work, and yet that side of the house at DEC never seems to have any engagement with renewable energy projects, for example. Like those staff, I don't know what they do. They do, I don't know, air pollution or something like that, but they don't interact with renewable energy at all. The only DEC staff who do are the resource protection staff. And what I see and have seen as long as I've ever worked with DEC is folks who are really good at a very narrow thing, whether it's a fish protection specialist or a butterfly protection specialist. That person's job is to protect that butterfly against all comers. And they do that part really well. But what they fail to do is integrate that butterfly's protection along with the wetlands and the other resources and the energy and the climate. And so it leads to siloed efforts that end up stopping projects constantly. Because, you know, one of the things for renewable energy is that it covers a lot of land and you have a lot of different stakeholders and different kind of resources. The thing with fossil fuels of all kinds is that any kind of fossil plant covers exactly 100 acres. You know, you can put a whole fossil plant on a 100-acre cornfield, and that's basically all the impacts you're going to have other than the cooling water. And so it's much easier for a fossil plant to get through DEC approval, weirdly, than it is for a renewable plant. And the staff there don't ever take a big picture view at all. And so, and no one basically ever tells them no. There is never a point at which they're forced to use data to defend themselves. So one example is the northern harrier, which is on the state threatened species list. It has been for a long time. It's not on a federal list. And there is no one to say that this bird should or should not be on that list. There's no publicly available data saying what the populations are of the northern harrier. What I can say is that every single solar project that has looked, and wind project in the state that has looked for harriers, finds it every single time. So thousands and thousands of acres of New York State. I mean, every place you send out a professional ornithologist to look for harriers, you find it. So it tells me it's not that threatened. But who's, you know, other than the renewable energy industry, who's going to say this doesn't need to be listed anymore? Let's treat it more like an everyday bird than a rare bird needing protection. And the result of that is that every single solar project and wind project needs to do these elaborate mitigation plans that ends up costing millions and millions of dollars for a bird that isn't actually endangered anymore. And DEC has no interest in delisting this bird. It's one of these like devils in the detail kind of things. Who the heck cares about the northern harrier's impact on energy prices and on the build out of renewables? Well, from an actual like in the field perspective, it has a huge impact, but nobody knows and nobody cares. Another one is the new wetlands law that got it put in place. And when I spoke to Roger Downs, who works at Sierra Club, who was hired by Sierra Club now probably 18 years ago to put in place this wetland law, and it has been his life's work to do. And he succeeded 2 years ago or whenever it was. And now we have a new wetlands law, and it is wildly, like it basically reduces project areas for every renewable project in the state by 50%. And so, you know, you have a 100-acre cornfield and it's going to have a couple soggy spots in the middle. And by and large, those soggy spots can be determined to be protected by DEC. So you have to be set back from them 100 feet. And so it turns a 100-acre cornfield into maybe 20 usable acres. And you have this patchwork, lacework of where you could build solar and where you can't build solar anymore. And so what should have been a single 100-acre solar field with no real environmental impacts, because the soggy spot had planted corn in it for years anyway, all of a sudden DC takes control of the whole thing, and in order to get some amount of solar in, you need to use 4 100-acre cornfields to put in the same amount of energy, and it's more expensive and it's more spread out and all this stuff. And that was never the impact, that was never the intent of the law, but that's the result of the law. And again, it's a DEC thing. If you wanted to change that, you'd have to go back and reopen the law. And there isn't a lot of ambition in the environmental community to do that because they do want to protect wetlands. We tried really hard in the drafting of the regulations to make it a more reasonable approach. I have some hope that the new head of the DEC, Amanda Lefton, is going to take a more balanced approach to how her agency works and try to get those folks to be sort of seeing the big picture of climate impacts in addition to resource protection, but we haven't had that leadership to date, and she's brand new in that role. So
Marguerite, I wanted to jump in and say, I think your assessment is really astute, and the idea that there's nobody there connecting the dots and
that's the challenge.
Understanding the big picture.
So if I were queen for a day, that's the sort of thing I'd do. Like last fall, I kind of got in a shin kicking match with the governor's team because we had provided them a list of 10 things the governor could do ASAP, and this is last September, that wouldn't require any new legislation or cost anyone any money. They were just things that if the governor got the gumption, she could say, thou shalt, you are my staff, and I want this done, and you shall do it. And none of those things have happened, and it's been a year. I'm sorry, one of the things has happened. Turbine transportation did get resolved, and I'll be glad for that. But the other 9 are still sitting on the shelf. So I would do those other 9 ASAP if I were queen for a day.
Can you send us that list of things? Because that it seems like, you know, there could be stuff that we could start pushing and advocating for.
Let me make a note right here to do so, or I'll forget.
Okay.
Yes.
That would be great, Marguerite.
Yeah.
You know, one of the issues I've been focused on recently, it has to do with methane emissions, and thus is loosely connected to some of the stuff you're talking about. But I was shocked when I read a recent report that the largest source of methane emissions in the state of New York are the landfills. And so that raises a whole nother basket of concerns. And of course, the largest emitter of methane emissions in the state of New York isn't a power plant, it's Seneca Meadows. And you know, stronger regulation of methane emissions at landfills is something that other states are tackling, and it's pretty low cost to do that. It's not about, you know, the goal here isn't necessarily to shut down landfills, but it is to do things that are pretty straightforward to dramatically reduce those emissions. And I was part of a group that had a Zoom meeting with the new commissioner and a whole bunch of her staff. And you know, and we talked about the extent to which their own strategic plan, a solid waste management plan, has a section on what they need to be doing to strengthen those regulations. But my impression was exactly yours. There were lots of, I mean, I was really actually pretty surprised at the number of staff who were on this call, and nobody there seemed to understand the actual urgency of this particular issue, and they just danced around it. And the new commissioner, I could understand
They don't
that.
solve it. Right.
But you know, I guess the point I'm making here is they're very good at dancing around these issues rather than tackling them.
Yeah. And they, you know, none of them lose their job or take a dock in their paycheck if they don't perform, unlike the private sector.
as Dave says, goes to jail.
Go to jail. Exactly right. And I think one of the other things is that the CLCPA expressly did not, it like excluded all renewable fuels and stuff like that. I'm not using the right terminology, but you know what I mean. And so it meant that the private sector has not invested in a lot of bio waste management because they're not incented to. So like Seneca Meadows can capture a little methane and generate a little electricity, and they do, but the cost of wholesale electricity is quite low. And so they're not incented to do that just for the raw cost of electricity. They're just competing with regular natural gas at that rate, which is cheap. And they're competing with renewables, which get incentives and are cheap. And if the CLCPA had included allowing capture of methane and turning that into electricity to be worth something from a climate perspective, then more actors would be in that space capturing more methane already. And there are actors who do that who are working in other states right now and not in New York because of that. So I think it's a miss that if whether we were to revisit the CLCPA or we talk about it in the draft energy plan, assigning value to the capture of methane and the prevention of its release, whether it's that it gets combusted or it gets turned into electricity or whatever management plan happens to that methane, it can get turned into renewable hydrogen too. Methane, there's mechanisms for translating methane into hydrogen. But in any event, if something were done with it from a climate law perspective, it'd be better than the nothing that's being done now.
Yeah, exactly. And I had another meeting with one other person joining with Anna Kellis, and she's really zeroed in on this whole issue of methane emissions from landfills, and
Yep.
She's become a very strong ally of ours.
Awesome.
And yeah, it's really I think going to be an
I think it's a fight worth taking on for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Dan.
Yeah, good morning, Marguerite. I was wondering if what your take is on the lawsuit brought by several environmental groups to implement the scoping plan that seems to be moving along. A judge in Ulster County heard the case last month, and it's about holding the administration task for implementing the plan. Is that a reason for any optimism on your part?
Well, this is I don't know. I mean, there's optimism just at the level that there is such a suit and it's being heard. Like, that's a great step. Will it actually get anywhere? I don't know. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I haven't followed it super closely, but I did see that a week or two ago, there was, I think it might be a letter that came from the Attorney General in defense of DEC in this case, that essentially made a circular argument, as I read it anyway, that said something to the effect of, well, DEC hasn't been able to do anything, so it hasn't done anything. And so it can't be blamed for not meeting the CLCPA because things haven't happened. And it was, I don't know, it just seemed wildly weak. And I mean, I know that the AG's job is to defend the state agencies by law, like that is actually their job. But to defend them so weakly and to just give the DEC a pass as if to say, well, it didn't really need to work on CLCPA and it didn't, so it doesn't matter, just pissed me off as a person.
It's like a chapter from Kafka's The Trial.
Right. Yeah, and so like, will the judge see through that and see it as a hollow argument? I don't know. I don't know the first thing about that judge. And even if the judge ruled in favor of the NGOs in that case, as a final ruling, will the state appeal it? Or what would the teeth be? I don't know. I haven't dug into it closely enough to know. I do know the folks at Sierra Club who have been leading that, so I could connect you if that was helpful. On the other hand, suing on behalf of the climate, even when it seems futile, seems like something worth doing these days. I myself am doing it, so I can hardly throw cold water on Sierra Club for trying.
Well, it's a few groups that are involved in the citizen action and Earth Justice. I think, to fill this gap between statutory requirements and actual implementation, this is, a very logical recourse to get this addressed. Because,
for sure.
we're...
Of course.
Yeah. So I would think if it's as obvious as we see it, the judge will see it too.
Here's for hoping.
Sounds like a good case study for your course, Dan.
Yeah. Add it to the list. There are a lot right now.
Right now.
Yeah.
I mean, the federal suit that I'm involved in, so that's alongside the 17th state attorneys general suing Trump for blocking the permitting of wind farms. And this is another one where, you know, if we win, it's a little bit of a hollow victory because it doesn't guarantee that the agencies will automatically resume permitting, because unless the judge were to put a I forget the exact term, but it's like an execution schedule into his ruling that says you shall issue X amount of permits in Y time zone, which there is no law to back him up on. And so he's unlikely to do such a thing. But without that, it means that the agencies could still choose to not issue permits. But at least it gives then each individual project the opportunity to sue on that, you know, project by project. And some projects would start to get permits because some agency staff at the federal level do still want to do their jobs. Some would choose not to do them and some would choose to do them, but at least it, you know, it's one more door to another brick wall, but it's at least it's through one more door. David, okay?
Yeah.
Oh,
Hey, Dave, let's let David go first.
Hi, thanks, Marguerite. Very depressing. Not the only thing these days. So I have kind of like I've always start with the observation that, in my opinion, so I'm going to focus on siting issues. In my opinion, the accelerated siting law, you know, it's like another morphing of all of the principles that were in the SECRA law to apply specifically to renewables, renewable generation facilities. So one of the things that I think has been happening over the years, which you're pointing to, I think is sort of a distorted application of what was initially intended by the environmental movement through the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and even you know, in different states as well. So my question is a political one, which is one of the Republican talking points is permit reform in general, not specifically around these issues, and they're obviously targeting in a negative way at the federal level, particularly wind and solar. But my question is there some potential for some kind of political alliance that would not be totally destructive around permit reform issues? That would,
at the national level, not the state level, you mean?
At the national level, that would have resonance for the state.
I hope so. I think there is a sliver of hope. I think it is one of the avenues that folks in the renewables space nationwide they don't want to hang their hat on it. I think after Trump's election and before he actually started doing anything, I think there was a greater level of hope, because if he had, you know, in his first administration, he didn't go after renewables. He's obviously a fossil guy, but if one were to truly take an all of the above approach and agnostically improve permitting for all the things, then permitting for fossil would get better and permitting for renewables would get better alongside each other. And I and many others were of the view that the renewables would still take the upper hand because they're fundamentally a better technology. And so, yeah, you'd get a little more fossil build out, but you'd also get a lot more renewables build out. And I think what has caught a lot of us by surprise is the degree to which this administration is actively trying to block renewables, more so than we had envisioned, even for things like transmission. You know, there was a huge transmission project that was supposed to go across the Midwest that would have brought renewable power towards the East more and towards the Chicago market. And it had all of its permits, and Trump actively killed it about a month ago. And it's like, why would you do that? Like, if we're genuinely an energy emergency and you want all your data center friends and your crypto friends to have all the power they need, why would you block them from having power? So one of the things I have been thinking about when I'm up at 2 in the morning is, what is the alliance we need to build that is much bigger than just the renewables tent, because the renewables tent has zero power right now. We got nothing. And we have way less public support than we've ever had, I think in part because the public narrative is so pro-fossil and anti-renewable that it seeps into people's minds. I think you get the people who don't really care and don't really know just sort of leaning the one way versus leaning the other way. And so I think, you know, if we were to try to make massive changes to the CLCPA or, you know, the wetlands law or anything like that, I think even everyday New Yorkers would be less supportive than they were a few years ago. And so at the federal level, I think we have no support. But if we could build an alliance that included the data center nerds and the, I don't know, maybe one of the things that has been on the fringes of possibilities is getting the American Petroleum Institute to actually come in and support of the renewables folks for a hot second, because they can see the danger of having the permits ripped out of the hands of a project that's under construction. And yeah, the shoe's on their foot right now, but when the shoe's on the other foot, it's going to mean that there's a whole lot less sympathy for them when they're not in power. And if they've got a fossil plant that's halfway built with all its permits, shall we stop it in its tracks? So, you know, whether we can actually get them to do that, I know a couple conversations along those lines have happened. They haven't come in yet, but they might. You know, the worse things get, the more they might realize that there's just value in the rule of law.
That's such an important point, Marguerite. I just think that there are really two issues there. One is the question of overregulation in the way that Ezra Klein talks about it in his new book, Abundance. And that's something you can wrap your head around. But the other issue here is just, as you said, going out and actively killing projects like this offshore wind farm in Rhode Island. You know, the idea that it was 80% complete and would have been operational next year. And he just
there was another one that hasn't even hit the press called US, but it also
he
got
steps in and pulls the plug, and you just go,
this makes no sense.
No, but it's like it has its equivalence, I think, in the way he approaches the tariffs. It's really just a way for him to show he's the boss.
Right, and to sow disarray in his wake.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me, before I get to you, Dave, let me just cover the last couple slides just to have covered this because we're running out of time, and then we'll pick the conversation back up. So just to briefly touch on what NYPA is doing. So the draft plan that comments are due, I think, the middle of September. I don't have the date in mind. Basically doubles the target of renewable projects that NYPA is allowed to build. Right now, their target is 3,500 megawatts, and this plan doubles it to roughly 7. And what has been, I think there was uncertainty in the renewable developer space on how this would actually play out in real life. And I think one of the pleasant surprises has been what a good partner NYPA has been. In that it has allowed, you know, I think NYPA took its remit to be that they are supposed to help get more renewables built in truth and actually bring more projects forward than would otherwise be coming forward. And so what they've done is they've partnered with developers rather than trying to elbow developers out. And that's been great because it's meant that projects that have some wrinkle in them that they need a little extra boost to get across the finish, NYPA has been that, especially for some of the smaller developers. And so I think developers across the board are delighted with the way NYPA has approached the sort of sharing of the effort thing, which I think is great. So the fact that they're doubling the plan, we're not going to say boo about it because it's like, well, it's more projects that need help. So I think that's a good thing. The comment period's open now until the 12th of September. And there's an online portal too, because the 2 virtual hearings are already passed, but written comments are still open. And developers can still submit projects into their portal to say, hey, would you like to buy this project? And the method that NYPA has been using is they sort of take a loose letter of intent kind of relationship with a project until it's of whatever particular maturity threshold, at which point they then take, I think it's 51% ownership stake in the project. And so I think one of the sort of points of contention in certain circles, especially in the build public power sector, is that NYPA should be doing way more. And there are just limits on what NYPA can do, both staff-wise, capital-wise. You can't incur more capital obligations to NYPA than a certain amount based on whatever the math is. And one of the challenges is that if NYPA owned 100% of the projects rather than just 51%, there would be a big local opposition problem, because really the only reason that projects are built in communities is because of the amount of money that the communities get from the project, whether it's through a pilot agreement, the host community agreements, and NYPA cannot and will not pay those. And so if NYPA were the sole developer or sole owner, they wouldn't be paying any of those local benefits. And those local benefits are the only reason that towns accept these projects at all. And so you'd really see increased opposition if you're getting all the same impact and you're getting no money. And so I think you can kind of see that. You know, I don't know how many of you have been to the town of Niagara Falls in New York, but it's a pretty rundown place. And it shouldn't be rundown because it's really getting, I mean, it has a huge hydro plant in it and has done for 100 years. That town should be in good shape, and it's not because it doesn't get money from the plant. You know, NYPA does some little community benefit things, but it does not drop the number of dollars per megawatt in that a solar or wind farm does per megawatt. And, you know, as a comparator, Lowville, which has tons of wind farm up in northern New York, you know, the school is beautiful, the town is nice, everything's in great repair, and people love renewable energy because they see how much money it puts in their community. And so I think that the partnership model for NYPA works because basically in their 51% ownership, they allow the private owner who still owns the other portion to pay those host community benefits. You know, it's NYPA doesn't appear to be paying them, but the private entity is paying them. And so it keeps the money flowing into the community in a really good way that I think would be a loss if that were not to be allowed to go forward anymore. One of the other questions that I didn't really mention, but is in the scoping plan, or I'm sorry, is in the draft state energy plan, opens the question again of should utilities own generation in the state? And this is just my little soapbox. I think it would actually make deployment of renewables worse, not better, for a few reasons. One, the utilities are already kind of maxed out, just trying to build out the transmission upgrades that they're supposed to be building in support of the CLCPA. Like NYSEG filed this thing this summer that said, well, you know, these phase 2 upgrades that were supposed to be online by whatever date, they're 4 years delayed because we basically don't have the money, we don't have the staff, and permitting's harder than we thought it was going to be when we initially laid out a schedule. And it's like, well, what'd you think? Permitting was easy 4 years ago in New York? Like, it's always been hard. Why did you miss so badly? The utilities already do develop projects in their unregulated arms. And so to put it under their regulated hats would basically just shift all that rate risk to the ratepayers. And so it would basically mean that Black Oak-like projects where, you know, in Black Oak's case, everybody who invested in Black Oak did so with eyes wide open. And they knew that they might lose their money, and they were investors who could afford to lose the money. And so when the whole thing failed and everybody lost their money, no one was happy, but no one was going hungry. And if utilities actually owned the generation and passed all the risk onto the ratepayers, then every time a project would fail, the ratepayers are paying for projects that didn't happen. And that ends up getting paid for by people who can't afford it, unlike Black Oak's investors. So that's my fear there, is it would basically drive away private investment and raise rates all the worse and still not get more things done because they're not better at it than other people. So I think that might be my last slide. Yep, that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop there and we can go back to questions and conversations for the next 4 minutes. And then I'm going to have to head out the door with my mother. I've been patiently waiting and thinking.
And go be a tourist again.
I'm going to go be a tourist again. Today I'm going to the US Open with my mom.
I couldn't help but remember, Marguerite, on the issue of community benefits, a particular community where that made no impression at all. And in spite of the obvious need for them to get that kind of funding. And I remember sitting at one town meeting with you, listening to them say, golly gee whiz, we don't have enough money for our fire department. And and this was the same meeting where they were basically doing everything they could to pull the plug on Black Oak. And I remember turning to you and going, are we the only ones who see a contradiction here?
Well, you're exactly right. And I see that all the time in communities that have decided they don't want this or that project. But for communities where they do want the project, at least that penny has dropped in those places and they would at least get the money. And one of the patterns I have seen in mapping this out statewide is that communities that have renewable projects tend to want more of them because they've seen the benefit and they've seen the money. And once they've got a taste of the money and what they can do with it, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you can actually help me rehab that old building that's downtown that, you know, that's an eyesore and it should be a coffee shop, or, you know, we could do whatever with the school playing field that hasn't been done in 30 years or whatever. Those places tend to want more, and it tends to be communities that don't have a taste of the money, that haven't got the imagination to think what it's really like to have money to play with, even if they're thinking to themselves, well, yeah, the fire department's out of money, where are we going to scrape together the money? I mean, literally this happened last week in Enfield again. They have a skate park that they don't have the money to finish paving, and they're like, gosh, it's too bad there's no money in the town budget. And, you know, John got up and said, well, you would have had a couple $100,000 a year if you hadn't kicked us out 10 years ago, but that's water under the bridge.
You said the town's name. I can't even bring myself to say it. So there
Well,
you
I've
go.
been through a lot of the PTSD just living there and still driving past and seeing the people. So I'm sort of out the other side of that emotional hurdle, but it's still a thing.
As close as I get to that particular town is going by your place. That's where I turn.
Yeah, I'd turn too.
Instead of going straight. Dave, Bradley, you've been very patient, and we have a limited amount of time, but you obviously have something on your mind.
Okay, well, just one thing quickly on the methane emissions. You don't have to convert methane into electricity. That's not your only option. In fact, that's the least profitable option you can have. For example, you could convert it into methanol, and it's over an 8 times profit level, as long as you go cheap methane. So that's just one thing. But the other thing you mentioned was the NYPA meetings. And I think this is a really important point, because people are going to get seriously conned if they don't wake up to this little sleight of words. NYPA and almost everybody in the meeting that I went to, which was on August 13th, kept speaking of renewable energy capacity, the capacity to make electricity. And that's pretty meaningless term, because the generation equipment doesn't actually have to work for you to install capacity. But the other thing is, you need various technologies have certain kind of I'll call them efficiencies, which is basically the amount of power delivered divided by the potential power or the capacity. And if you don't get hip to this issue, we're going to find out that pretty much all the projects, renewable projects that will go into New York, will probably be solar. And the net capacity of solar is less than 15% upstate. So you could
No,
put in,
it's more like 22% for the utility scale projects.
but for most typical people, it's around 15, or NYPA listed 13.4% for Tompkins County. But the bottom line is wind, onshore wind and offshore wind are much more efficient. And so if you say 15 gigawatts of capacity for solar, that could quite well mean 2 gigawatts on a delivered basis. And for onshore wind, if you use the right kind of turbines, that would be about 6 gigawatt delivered. And for offshore wind, based on the initial results that we're getting out of South Fork, it's a 50% net efficiency. So that's 7.5 gigawatts. So it's quite conceivable that they could satisfy the 15 gigawatt capacity rule and yet only achieve 34% of the CPLC goal for 2030, which would be about 34% of net electricity. And I don't include nukes, because we don't know if the nukes are actually going to make it for much more than 10 years. They're all extremely old. They're not necessarily that reliable, and they've all got a history, except for, I think, Fitzpatrick, of really having serious issues that require 1 to 2 years of downtime. So, but that's the kicker is you have to focus on the amount of electricity that's going to be delivered from a project, and just ignore the capacity.
The megawatt hours is where
you're
it's
going to
at.
get scammed.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And the energy nerds in the state all recognize the difference between capacity factor and nameplate capacity and the actual megawatt hours that are delivered. So all of that is definitely factored into how the projects get studied when they interconnect, how they get awarded contracts, all that sort of thing. The everyday person definitely doesn't pay attention to that, or they're only sort of cursorily aware to say, well, renewables, they come and go, and, you know, thermal is permanent. They don't realize that, to your point, you know, a lot of thermal plants can be offline for a year at a time. So they're differently intermittent than renewables.
Yeah, and you don't get paid on capacity, you get paid on the amount of energy that's delivered.
That's exactly right. Well, I mean, the thermal plants do get paid on capacity, but renewable plants do not.
By and large, you know, the thing that makes the project viable is that, you know, it generates a certain amount of electricity, they get a certain amount of money for it, and that's got to cover their loan payments.
Yep, you have to generate to make money. All right, I'm going to have to hop here. So I wanted to thank you all for having me.
Thanks so much, Marguerite.
Feel free to email any questions, and I'll try to remember to follow up with whatever the note was that I made earlier from my conversation with Irene. So sorry to jump.
No, it's really want to thank you for taking this time and on fairly short notice. But it's always great to see you, and it's too bad it's more on Zoom than in person.
Indeed. Well, happy